Hannah Miller checked the clock above the therapy desk and wished it would move faster, not because she wanted the day to end, but because she wanted to avoid the conversation waiting for her in the staff room. She could already imagine the smiles, the teasing voices, the gentle but relentless push toward a date she did not want. Since the breakup, the rumors, the quiet judgment, she had learned to survive by keeping her head down and her heart locked. Today, however, the walls felt thinner and her co-workers had decided it was time to intervene now tonight somehow. They cornered her with coffee and practiced casualness, telling her about a friend of a friend who had just moved to San Diego, a man who worked too much and needed to meet real people. Hannah smiled, made excuses, reached for her bag, and still they pressed on. She finally agreed, the way tired people agree, with a nod that felt like surrender. On the walk to her car, the old memories returned without invitation. The voice of the man who once loved her only when it suited him, the same man who later called her pure as an insult. That night, she stood in front of the mirror, longer than she wanted to admit, not choosing beauty but choosing armor. If the world insisted on misreading her, she would write the lie first. If men wanted a label, she would give them one that made her unreachable. At the small coastal bar where the date was set, the air smelled of salt and citrus and conversation. Lucas arrived on time, calm, unassuming, wearing no sign of the secret weight he carried. He asked about her work, about the body and its long road back from damage, and he listened. Hannah felt the familiar tightening in her chest as the first quiet questions arrived, the ones that always came before expectations. She took a breath that trembled only once, and then said the sentence she had practiced in her head like a shield. She told him she was not a virgin, told him she was not the kind of woman men married for promise or pride. The words fell between them and waited. She waited for the flicker of judgment, the polite distancing, the quick decision to leave. Around them, glasses clinked and strangers laughed, unaware of the small battle. Lucas did not move away. He did not smile with embarrassment or retreat with courtesy. He only looked at her, steady and unreadable for a heartbeat, then softened in a way she did not expect. He said quietly that he was not there to buy anyone virtue or measure anyone worth by what they kept or gave away. His voice carried no sermon, only fact. The sentence landed harder than any rejection could have. Hannah felt heat rise behind her eyes, not from shame but from shock. Nearby, a couple paused their conversation, sensing the shift, and then looked away. They talked after that, carefully at first, then with a strange ease that surprised her. He asked what drew her to her patients, to bodies that learned to walk again, and hands that learned to trust again. She told him about the veterans who shook when the doors slammed, about small victories that felt like miracles. He did not interrupt with pity or applause. He simply listened as if her world mattered. For the first time in years, Hannah felt seen without being marketed, understood without being claimed. Somewhere between sentences, the lie lost some of its power, even as, when they stood to leave, a ripple of attention followed them, not from drama but from curiosity. Outside, the ocean wind brushed her face and cooled the ache behind her eyes. Lucas offered to walk her to her car, and she surprised herself by saying yes. As they moved down the sidewalk, his phone vibrated again and again, and each time he turned it face down without checking. She noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the discipline of someone used to being summoned. At her door, he asked if he could see her again, not as a plan, but Hannah watched him step back into the streetlight, a stranger and not a stranger at all. Only after he drove away did she allow the breath she had been holding to escape. She told herself that nothing had changed, that the lie had done its job by keeping her safe, yet her hands still shook. What she did not know was that the quiet man who had refused to judge her owned a global biomedical empire, that the calls he ignored were from lawyers and investors, that his name moved markets. As she turned the key in her door, the second date happened by accident, in the way important things often do when people pretend they are not hoping for them. Hannah told herself that she was only agreeing to coffee because it was daytime and public and safe, and because she owed Lucas a return for listening without judgment the night before, not because she had replayed his voice in her head as she worked through muscle memory and scar tissue all morning. The cafe sat across from the small coastal park where she sometimes walked patients when they were strong enough to face uneven ground, and the salt air carried the cries of gulls and the distant rhythm of waves. Lucas was already there when she arrived, seated at a corner table with his phone face down and 2 cups between his hands, as if he had been unsure which one she might want. The simple detail startled her more than the money ever would. She took the seat across from him with the careful posture of someone still prepared to retreat at the first sign of expectation. They talked about ordinary things at first, about traffic, and the strange way coastal weather changed moods, and then, almost without warning, Lucas asked how she had learned to be patient with bodies that would not obey their owners anymore. The question was not polite curiosity but genuine interest, and Hannah hesitated only a moment before answering. She told him about her first job out of school at a small veterans clinic in Riverside, about the man who refused to stand because he was convinced his legs did not belong to him anymore, about the weeks she spent earning his trust one breath at a time. As she spoke, the memory tightened her throat, and she was surprised by how easily the emotion rose after so many years of controlled presentation. Lucas did not interrupt. He watched her with the kind of attention she usually saw only in family members who were afraid to miss something important. When she finished, he said that it sounded like a job built for courage disguised as routine. The words warmed her in a way she had forgotten was possible. She found herself asking about his work in return, and he answered in broad shapes without labels, saying that he worked in medical innovation, that he spent most of his days in rooms where people argued about what was possible and what would never work, and that sometimes the best part of his job was seeing something impossible take its first breath in a laboratory. He spoke with restraint, as if the details were personal, not because they were confidential, but because they mattered. The restraint made her trust him more than a list of famous names ever could. Time moved sideways while they talked. She forgot to guard each sentence. She forgot to measure what she revealed for safety. When the cups were empty and the sun stood higher than she realized, Lucas asked if she wanted to walk with him for a while. She almost said no out of habit, but the word turned into yes before she could stop it. They crossed into the park where children chased kites and older couples moved at the slow pace of shared years. As they walked, Hannah noticed the way Lucas adjusted his stride to match hers without comment, a quiet accommodation that told her more about him than any story. She told him about the nights she spent rebinding anatomy textbooks because she could not afford new ones during school, about the first paycheck that felt like proof she had arrived somewhere safe, about the invisible fear that followed her into every relationship after the man who had twisted her faith in people into a weapon. Lucas listened, and when she mentioned the breakup, his jaw tightened for only a fraction of a second. He asked nothing at first, giving her space to choose her own edges. The lie from the night before hovered like a ghost between them, unspoken but present, and she wondered if he would ever ask her to explain it. Instead, he said that he knew something about betrayal, not the details but the temperature of it, the way it could make even sunshine feel conditional. She looked at him then and saw a shadow she had not noticed before, a weight that did not belong to the calm man walking beside her, but was part of him all the same. It softened her. They sat on a low stone wall near the water and watched a group of veterans from the nearby clinic maneuver through a mobility exercise that Hannah had once helped design. One man stumbled and laughed it off with embarrassment, and Hannah lifted a hand in a small sign they both understood, a reminder to breathe and reset. Lucas followed the exchange with quiet fascination. He asked how she learned the language of small signals, and she told him that pain taught people to lie with their mouths, but their bodies were terrible liars. He considered that, with a seriousness that made her feel as if she had offered him a key. Later, when they stood again, a stranger approached Lucas and spoke his name softly with the familiarity of someone used to calling it in hallways where power traveled fast. Hannah caught only fragments of the conversation, but it was enough to feel the shift in the air, enough to see how Lucas straightened without stiffening, how his voice dropped into a register of authority she had not heard before. When the stranger left, he apologized for the interruption, and for the first time, she sensed the shape of another life pressing close to the one he was showing her. She did not ask who the man was. She did not ask what the interruption meant. Part of her feared that questions might pull down a curtain she was not yet ready to see behind. Instead, she spoke about the way the clinic lost funding every year, and how they learned to treat ingenuity as a currency. Lucas listened as before, but she noticed the tension in his hands had not entirely faded. When he asked if he could drive her home, she surprised herself again by agreeing. His car was modest by any visible standard but immaculate, and she realized that whoever he was in the world beyond this space valued control in neat, quiet ways. As they drove, he kept one hand on the wheel and one resting lightly near the center console, never touching her, never rushing. At her building, he parked and walked her to the door as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She felt the moment hovering, the place where many evenings turned into expectations and misunderstandings, and she braced herself for the language that usually followed. Lucas only said that he had enjoyed the time and asked if he could see her again when she felt ready. Not tomorrow. Not soon. Ready. The word landed with an ache that surprised her. She told him she would think about it, and meant that she would. Inside her apartment, she leaned her forehead against the door after it closed and listened to her own breath until it steadied. She told herself that nothing real could grow from a beginning built on a lie, but the memory of his face when he said he was not there to buy anyone, virtue returned with disarming clarity. The next morning at the clinic, one of her patients asked casually if she had a new glow, and she dismissed it with a joke, unaware that her nurse supervisor was watching her with new interest from the end of the hall. By afternoon, 2 messages waited on her phone from the same unknown number. The first was a request to return a missed call. The second said only that investors were growing anxious. Hannah read the words without context and dismissed them as another wrong number, in a city full of crossed signals. She went home and cooked a simple meal she barely tasted. When her phone rang later that evening and Lucas' name appeared, she hesitated only a second before answering. He asked how her day had been and she told him about the man who finally climbed 3 stairs on his own, about the small triumph that made everything hard feel worth it. Lucas told her that he had watched an experimental device respond to its first successful command that day, and that the room had gone silent, as if everyone had forgotten how to breathe. They shared the victory across separate worlds, and the connection felt stronger than either wanted to admit. When she hung up, Hannah realized with a quiet shock that the date she never intended to happen had begun to rearrange the careful rules she lived by. She also did not know that by answering that call she had stepped closer to a storm already turning toward both of them. Hannah noticed the first sign on a Thursday morning, when Lucas walked into the clinic just before opening hours, and waited quietly near the reception desk, as if he belonged there without needing permission. He wore the same calm expression he always carried, yet something in the line of his shoulders felt different, as if he had arrived from a place where calm was an achievement rather than a habit. She asked what brought him so early, and he said he was on his way to an appointment nearby, and did not want to miss the chance to see her for a minute, even if she was busy. The answer should have made her smile, yet it stirred a faint unease she could not name. Over the next week, the signs repeated in small, almost invisible ways. His phone rang during their walks, and he never checked the screen in front of her, but he always stepped a short distance away, to answer in a voice that changed texture, without changing volume. Once she caught a glimpse of the caller name reflected in a dark shop window, and saw only the first letter before he turned the device face down again. Another afternoon, a black sedan slowed near the park where they sat, and continued on after he lifted his head just once. It could have been coincidence, yet Hannah had learned to trust the weight of patterns. She did not confront him because the part of her that feared questions had grown used to staying quiet, when quiet felt safer than clarity. At the clinic, the whispers began from the opposite direction. A new administrator took over scheduling and asked Hannah more questions about her private life than about her patients. The questions arrived wrapped in smiles and praise for her dedication, but the pivot toward curiosity was too frequent to be harmless. One of the aides joked that she must be seeing someone important to glow that way, and Hannah brushed it off even as the comment lodged under her skin. She had not labeled what was growing between her and Lucas, yet the world seemed to be labeling it for her without permission. When Lucas called that evening and asked if she would join him for dinner at a place farther inland than they had ever gone together, she hesitated longer than she wanted to admit. He said it would be quiet, and that he had a reason to be there, though he did not share what the reason was. Something in his voice sounded like preparation, and she agreed with a reluctance she could not quite justify. The restaurant was understated and private in the way only places frequented by powerful people could be. There were no visible guards, yet the door was watched with eyes that did not rest on menus. Lucas greeted 2 men in passing by first names Hannah had never heard, and she felt again the sense of standing near a doorway to another world. During dinner he spoke less about work than ever, and asked more about hers, as if he wanted to anchor the conversation firmly in her universe. When the check arrived, it did not come with a bill but with a respectful nod of acknowledgement, and Lucas thanked the server with a formality that spoke of routine. Outside, 2 voices called his name from a parked car, and he answered with ease before turning back to Hannah, as if nothing had interrupted them. The moment passed, but it left an imprint. She asked him directly at last if he was hiding something from her. He met her eyes and said that everyone hid things when they were afraid of losing what mattered. The answer was not a lie, yet it was not a truth either, and they both knew it. The next sign came as a warning she could not ignore. A stranger waited near the back entrance of the clinic one afternoon, and asked her by name if she had time to answer a few questions. He did not raise his voice, yet the words felt like a claim. Hannah refused with practiced politeness and told him to leave. The man smiled with professional patience and said that he would try again another day. She walked back inside with the strange sensation that the air had thickened around her without a change in temperature. When she told Lucas about it that night, his expression hardened in a way she had not seen before, and he asked what the man looked like and what he had said with a focus that startled her. He told her that sometimes curiosity followed people who never asked to be noticed, and that he would make sure she remained safe. The word safe echoed with a weight she had not expected from him, and she wondered what dangers he had already imagined on her behalf. Her patients noticed the change before she did. One of the veterans told her that she seemed distracted during therapy, and she apologized without explanation. Another remarked that the news camera outside the building must be covering a story nearby, and pointed out the van parked across the street. Hannah tried to reassure them, yet unease pooled around her chest like cold water. At the end of the week, the director called her into the office and asked if she had any connections that might bring attention to the clinic. The question was posed as curiosity but carried the timbre of caution. Hannah answered truthfully that she did not know yet. The lie she had told on the first night rose in her memory with new weight. On her way home, a crowd had gathered near the corner where she usually crossed the street. She slowed when she saw the cameras and the cluster of people who looked like they were waiting for something to happen rather than watching what already was. A microphone lifted and a voice asked if she would comment on the man she had been seen with near the coast. Before she could answer, Lucas stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, where she had not seen him, and placed himself between her and the lens. The cameras fired with sudden hunger. He did not shout or threaten. He only said that if anyone needed a statement they could speak with his legal team, and then he took her hand and led her away through the parted crowd as if through water. They drove in silence for a long moment after that. Hannah felt the tremor in her hands even as he held the wheel steady. She asked him if this was what his normal life looked like, and he did not answer at once. When he did speak, he said that attention was not a life but a condition, and that it was one he had learned to manage long before they met. She asked him why the cameras had been waiting for him near her clinic. He told her that sometimes the world watched for reasons that had nothing to do with the truth and everything to do with power. The answer satisfied nothing in her, yet it held the ring of experience. He dropped her off at her building and did not kiss her goodbye as he sometimes did. He only rested his forehead briefly against hers, as if grounding himself, and said that he would explain everything soon. That night, Hannah could not sleep. Her phone vibrated twice, with messages from unknown numbers that disappeared when she tried to open them. An article appeared online with her building half blurred in the background, and a headline that asked a question it did not intend to answer. She closed the browser with shaking hands and sat on the edge of her bed until the sky began to pale. The next morning, a different administrator was waiting in the staff room and asked Hannah to come to a meeting later that day. When Hannah tried to call Lucas, her call went to voicemail, and a tight, quiet fear took that as another sign she did not understand yet could not dismiss. The meeting was brief and oddly formal. The board members spoke in careful language about image and community trust and invisible pressures that never named their source. Hannah listened as if from outside her body while they asked if there was anything in her personal life that could draw negative attention to the clinic. She said that she was seeing someone, and that she did not believe that was cause for discipline. The men exchanged a look that was neither agreement nor disagreement, and told her that they would be in touch. When she returned to the therapy floor, her nurse supervisor avoided her eyes. She finished her afternoon sessions with a steady voice that hid the fracture growing behind it. Outside, Lucas was waiting for her as if he had sensed the moment she needed him most. He said that the headlines were accelerating faster than he had expected, and that he had wanted to protect her from them for a little longer. Hannah stopped walking and looked at him with a clarity she had been avoiding for days. She told him that protection without truth felt too much like manipulation. He listened and did not argue. He said only that the truth was heavy, and that once it was spoken, there would be no pretending either of them could return to the version of their lives they had carried before. In the distance she heard the surf as she had on the first night, yet now the sound felt like a warning rather than an invitation. They stood facing each other on the sidewalk as strangers passed without noticing the storm suspended between them. Hannah asked him again who he truly was beyond the man who listened without judging and walked beside her without rushing. He took a breath that filled his chest and held it, as if making room for a weight he was about to set down. Before he could speak, a car door slammed at the end of the street, and a familiar camera lens turned toward them with renewed focus. Hannah followed his gaze and saw the approaching group of reporters moving with purpose. In that instant she realized that whatever truth Lucas carried was no longer waiting for the right moment to arrive. It was already breaking toward them with the force of a tide neither of them had asked to face yet. Part 4. The Billionaire exposed. Word count, 1,420. Hannah learned the truth the way most modern people learn disasters, through a vibration in her pocket and a rush of noise on a screen. It happened just after sunset when she was sitting alone on the edge of her bed, still waiting for Lucas to call back after the day that had felt like walking through glass. Her phone lit up with a dozen notifications at once, and for a moment she thought something had happened at the clinic. Instead, she saw his face before she saw his name. The image was sharp and merciless. Lucas stepping out of a black car flanked by men in dark suits, his hand raised to shield his eyes from the cameras, his expression unmistakably his, and yet entirely different from the man who drank cheap coffee across from her and asked about scar tissue and hope. The headline beneath the photo named him fully and without mercy: Lucas Ward, billionaire, founder of Ward Neurolabs, spotted with mystery woman near San Diego clinic. Hannah felt the air leave her lungs, as if the room had suddenly lost oxygen. Billionaire. The word rearranged every memory she had of him in a single, violent sweep. The ignored phone calls, the legal team, the way rooms had shifted around him, the moment he entered them all, rushed into alignment with cruel clarity. She scrolled in disbelief, as more articles loaded, some careful, some vicious, some already building stories far larger than the truth could sustain. They called her a mystery woman as if she were an accessory, not a person. They speculated with the lazy confidence of strangers who believed that wealth explained everything it touched. Her hands began to shake, and she pressed the phone against her thigh to steady it, but the tremor traveled upward anyway. Minutes later, another vibration struck, and this time, it was Lucas calling at last. Hannah let it ring twice before answering, because she needed the sound of her own breath first. He did not preface the truth when she picked up. He said he was sorry and that he had meant to tell her before the world did it for him. The sentence landed like a wound opening, and she realized that the cut itself was not the secret, but the timing. She asked him if everything she had seen was true. He said yes, without qualification. He told her that Ward Neurolabs had grown faster than anyone had intended, and that he had learned early on that money magnified both help and harm, and that he had tried to keep their days together untouched by that amplification for as long as he could. Hannah listened without interrupting because the silence had grown heavier than his voice. She asked him one question, and it was the only one that mattered to her then. She asked if she had ever been just a distraction to him, an experiment in normal that he could abandon the moment real life demanded him back. Lucas answered without pause and said no, and the certainty in his tone cut through the fear like a beam of clean light. He said that she had been the first person in years who did not look at him as a ledger or a headline, and that he had been greedy enough to want to keep that illusion alive for as long as possible. The honesty arrived too late to soften the shock, but it steadied her enough to stay on the line. The next morning, Hannah did not have the luxury of private reckoning, because the world had decided that her story was now public property. When she arrived at the clinic, a cluster of reporters waited across the street where the sidewalk narrowed into shadow. Their cameras lifted at once when they noticed her, and she felt the instinct to run but forced herself to walk past with measured steps. Inside, the air felt charged as if every whisper were carrying electricity. Co-workers who had once greeted her with casual warmth now watched with unease that tried to pass as discretion and failed. The new administrator took her aside and asked in a careful voice whether she had been aware of the man she was seeing and his public profile. Hannah answered truthfully that she had learned only the night before. The woman nodded with professional sympathy, yet Hannah saw calculation flicker behind the expression. By midday, the first opinion piece appeared questioning whether a clinic that treated vulnerable veterans should allow one of its employees to attract media attention through personal choices. The sentence burned her even as she read it because it framed her existence as a liability rather than a life. Lucas arrived at the clinic in the early afternoon, not through the front entrance but through the narrow service corridor that Hannah usually used to slip out for air between sessions. He looked different to her now, and not because he was richer than she had imagined, but because she could see the weight he carried to protect the spaces he moved through. He took her hands in that dim hallway and told her that he would call off the media if she wanted, that he could make the attention disappear as swiftly as it had arrived. The offer was not a boast but a reflex, and the speed of it frightened her more than the cameras ever had. Hannah said that she did not yet know what she wanted except not to be spoken for by anyone else. Lucas accepted that without argument and asked if he could speak with the board if needed. She told him to wait and surprised herself with the firmness of the request. A line she did not know she had drawn had just revealed itself under her feet. The afternoon unraveled quickly after that. A producer from a daytime talk show called the clinic asking for comment. A blogger published a grainy image of Hannah through a window and asked whether she had been strategically placed near patients whose stories might soften the billionaire image. Hannah moved through her sessions on autopilot, her body doing what it had been trained to do even as her mind reeled. When her last patient left, she found the director waiting with 2 members of the board, both men she had rarely seen in person before. They asked her again about the relationship and she told the truth again. They spoke in concerned tones about the optics for donors and the pressure from outside forces and the need to protect the clinic reputation. They did not accuse her outright, but the shape of the accusation filled the room without language. Hannah left the office with a trembling that lived deep in her bones, and when she found Lucas waiting at the end of the hall, she did not know whether to step toward him or away. That evening, the truth reached new ears with a ferocity that no apology could slow. Lucas' family released a statement confirming his identity and his role within the company, and urging respect for the private individuals involved. The wording protected shareholders even as it claimed to protect her. Hannah watched the briefing online and recognized the caution of trained lawyers, shaping every syllable. Comment sections erupted with certainty from strangers who now believed they owned her motives. Some painted her as naive, others as predatory, others as a clever symbol manufactured for market narrative. No one asked who she was when no cameras were pointed at her. She turned off the screen when speculation began about whether her work with veterans was a conscious ploy to soften his public image. Late that night, Lucas came to her apartment and stood in the doorway without crossing the threshold until she nodded. He said that she could end everything now if she wanted and that he would not chase her in public or in private. The statement hurt more than any promise could have, because it honored her autonomy at the moment she felt most invaded. Hannah sat across from him on the narrow couch and spoke without guarding each word for the first time since the stories broke. She told him that she did not know how to carry the weight of a world that made money into a character reference for every human action. She told him that her lie on the first night had been a shield, and that now the truth felt like a blade turned against her by people she had never met. Lucas listened, without rescuing, without reframing, without softening it into strategy. When she finished, he said that the exposure would only deepen, and that the people who thrived on spectacle would not be satisfied with the truth, because it was too small and too human for their appetite. The honesty of that warning frightened her more than the headlines had. The following day, the name Billionaire no longer felt abstract. It arrived in her life with consequences. When she entered the clinic, she found a notice posted near the front desk, announcing that all media inquiries would be directed to administration and that staff were advised not to engage with reporters in any capacity. The language was careful, yet the message felt like a muzzle. A patient asked if she would still be his therapist if the cameras kept coming, and she assured him that she would. She did not yet know whether that promise was a lie. At lunch, her nurse supervisor told her gently that sponsors had called asking whether the clinic planned to review its public-facing policies in light of recent events. Hannah nodded and wondered how many invisible meetings were being scheduled without her name on the agenda. That night, Lucas invited her to see the place where all of this power lived, and for a moment, she thought he meant his office. Instead, he drove her north into the hills, where the city lights fell away and a private road curved behind a hidden gate. The house that rose beyond it was not ostentatious in lights, but vast in quiet stone and shadow. Hannah felt small before she had even stepped inside and hated the reflex. Lucas watched her with the concern of someone who knew exactly what the scale meant and what it could do to a person not accustomed to measuring themselves against it. Inside, the walls held art and silence and the careful gravity of generational wealth. He told her that his grandfather had built the foundation one ambitious contract at a time, and that every generation had added rooms, as if proving that growth was the only language they knew how to speak. Hannah heard none of it. She only saw how far she had wandered in a life that no longer felt like her own. They stood in the open space that passed for a living room, and Hannah asked him directly whether loving someone like her was worth the damage being done to her name already. Lucas answered that he did not measure worth in market loss or gain, and that if the world insisted on assigning a price to her, they had already misunderstood everything about what had drawn him to her. The words should have comforted her, but all she saw was the widening distance between who she had been when she walked into that small bar, and who the world had decided she was now allowed to be. As the city glittered far below the windows, she realized that the secret he had tried to keep from her had not protected her at all. It had only delayed the moment when the truth arrived with enough force to fracture the life she had built around being unseen. She left before the night was over, not in anger but in a quiet that felt more dangerous. By the time she reached her apartment, her name had already been attached to him in every version of the story that money could buy. Hannah learned how quickly a name could be stripped of its owner when it became convenient for a story. By morning, every search result for her face led with the same suggestion that she had engineered her way into a billionaire world through carefully staged innocence and carefully marketed scandal. The lie she had told in a moment of fear was now repackaged as strategy, and the truth of her work reduced to a costume someone else had dressed her in. Bloggers speculated with rehearsed confidence that she had chosen a clinic near the coast to intersect with elite traffic, and that her patients were props in a campaign of calculated sympathy. Commentators used words like manipulation and transaction, as if those ideas explained everything that could not be bought. Hannah sat at her kitchen table with cold coffee and watched her life be summarized by people who had never stood inside it. By the time she reached the clinic that afternoon, the whispers had turned into distance. Doors did not close in her face, but they paused before opening. Conversations softened to a careful pitch when she passed. The nurse supervisor who used to tease her about staying late now studied her with professional reserve. During her first session, a patient asked quietly if seeing her would bring cameras to his room, and the question pierced deeper than any accusation, because it came from someone with no reason to perform. Hannah promised that she would not let that happen, and meant it even as she wondered whether she still had the power to keep that promise. At lunch, she found an envelope waiting in her locker with printed screenshots of posts she had not read yet and could not avoid. They followed a narrative already spreading that she had played the long game of virtue only to cash it in at the right moment. One headline suggested she had been discovered because of the very purity she pretended to defend. Another questioned whether her work with veterans was an audition for public forgiveness. The words were arranged with the precision of knives, and Hannah felt each one find its place without drawing visible blood. By late afternoon, a live stream appeared on a popular channel devoted to celebrity accountability, and the host spoke about Hannah as if she were a cautionary tale already complete. He described her as a figure who understood that the modern market rewarded moral theater as much as product, and he suggested that the simplest explanation was usually the correct one. The chat scrolled faster than she could read. Strangers who did not know her age or her voice argued over whether she was clever or careless, and whether she deserved the attention she claimed not to want. Someone posted the address of the clinic, and another asked whether the building had security. Hannah turned off the sound and kept the image frozen on a smiling face that was nothing like hers. She felt a strange calm settle over her, as if her fear had found a wall and chosen not to climb it. The calm lasted until the director summoned her again, near the end of the day. This time the office held more bodies and less warmth. The board members sat in a line that implied decision, and the director used the word narrative more than once as if it were a tool rather than a verdict. They spoke about donor calls and sponsor unease, and the responsibility of the clinic to remain a sanctuary free from spectacle. They told her that no one was accusing her of wrongdoing and that the problem was only perception. Hannah listened and realized that perception had already been measured and found profitable by people with louder voices than hers. When she left the office, she found Lucas waiting outside as he had the day before, and the sight of him no longer offered uncomplicated relief. He looked tired in a way that suggested battles she could not see, and he asked if she was all right, as if the question still had room for ordinary answers. Hannah told him that the world had decided what she was, and that she did not recognize the picture. He said that he would release a full statement and correct the lies with facts. She asked him if facts had ever beaten appetite when money was involved. He did not answer immediately, and the delay spoke for him. That evening, the first invitation arrived to appear on a panel about morality in public life. The subject line promised a chance to defend herself, but the list of other speakers made the intent obvious. It was not a defense that was wanted, but a spectacle of denial to be interrupted and edited. Hannah declined without explanation. An hour later, another invitation arrived from a morning show, offering a soft chair and a kind host, and a segment on her dedication to service. The kindness felt like another mask worn for the same outcome. She declined again and watched the count of unanswered messages climb. The attack sharpened as the night deepened. A widely shared essay framed her as an emblem of a larger problem in which women learn to treat identity as a currency to be traded upward. The writer admitted that she could not know Hannah's true motives, and then proceeded to define them anyway with the authority of metaphor. Someone dug up a school photo that showed her at 17 and asked when the performance had begun. Another cited the lie about her virginity as proof of a personality built for deception, and suggested that a woman who could lie about something sacred could lie about anything. Hannah read until the words blurred and then closed her eyes and listened to her own pulse, to remind herself that she was still inside her body, and not only inside a story. The next morning, a protest formed without warning outside the clinic gate. It was small at first, only 6 people holding signs that asked questions no one expected to answer. By noon the number had tripled and the questions had become accusations. Hannah watched from the window as patients arrived through a corridor of raised phones and shouted judgments. The staff moved with emergency protocol efficiency, yet the air carried fear she could not treat with any technique she knew. One of the veterans turned back, rather than face the crowd, and the sight hollowed her chest. Lucas arrived before the police did, and stood at the front of the steps without raising his voice. He asked the group to leave the patients out of whatever anger they were trying to resolve. Someone shouted his name, and the crowd rippled at the recognition. A chant began that did not choose a target between them, because it treated them as one symbol now, regardless of the truth. Hannah stepped forward despite his call to stay back, and felt the heat of attention strike her skin. She said nothing. She only stood and let the storm pass around her until officers guided the group to disperse. By evening the footage was everywhere edited for impact rather than sequence. The clip ended just before Lucas shielded her from a thrown object, so that it appeared she was being confronted rather than protected. A voiceover described the moment as accountability in action. The director called Hannah at home and asked her not to come in the next day, while the situation cooled. The request arrived, wrapped in concern, but the effect was exile without paper or explanation. Hannah hung up and sat in the dark without turning on the lights. Lucas came an hour later, carrying the exhaustion of a man who had been bracing for a collision and still been injured by it. He told her that his own board had begun to question whether public association with her threatened pending contracts, and that he had told them that the threat lay with cowardice, not with truth. The words were brave and expensive, and Hannah felt the cost of them in the silence that followed. She asked him whether he still wished he had told her sooner. Lucas said that he wished he had told her sooner, and that he also wished he had understood sooner how quickly the world punished anyone it could not own. Later that night, a legal letter arrived at her door, without warning, delivered by a service that did not knock. It was a notice of potential action, citing concern from a moral advocacy group that claimed to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. The document accused her of gaining access to donors under false pretenses, and suggested that her relationship with Lucas constituted an attempt to leverage intimacy for financial advantage. The threat was not yet a suit, but it was written as if the conclusion were inevitable. Hannah read the pages once and then again and felt the strange sensation of being erased by language she had not agreed to speak. Lucas offered to connect her to his attorneys immediately. She asked him not to. She said that every solution his world offered came at the price of reinforcing the story that she could not stand on her own. The refusal hurt him more than any insult, and she saw that too. In the quiet that followed, she realized that the attack had achieved its unspoken aim. It had started to bend their choices without their consent. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it brought dreams in which she stood in a room of mirrors, each reflecting a version of herself she did not recognize. Morning arrived with fresh headlines and a trending tag that turned her name into a shorthand for falling from imagined grace. The director left a voice message saying that the board would meet again soon. Lucas left another saying that he would be in court all day, pushing back on early motions he had not yet told her about. Hannah sat on the edge of her bed with the weight of it pressing down through muscles and bone, and understood that the world had already decided she was guilty of wanting more than she was allowed, and that no explanation would be permitted to undo that verdict. The moral character assassination had not waited for evidence because it had never been about facts at all. It had been about appetite and spectacle, and the ease with which a woman could be turned into currency for outrage. She rose and dressed with the same care she had given to armor on the night of the lie, and stepped out into a day that no longer pretended it would let her pass unnoticed. Hannah arrived at the clinic on the morning of her termination with a strange sense of calm, as if her body had already stepped ahead of her fear and chosen resignation before anyone else could force it on her. The building looked the same from the outside, yet it felt sealed off from her in a way she could not explain. The protesters were gone, but their absence did not feel like peace. It felt like a pause between storms. Inside the waiting room, one of her veterans looked up with relief when he saw her, and she returned the smile automatically, even as her chest tightened with a knowledge she had not yet earned the right to share. The director asked her to come to the boardroom before her first session, and the request carried no softness at all. When Hannah entered the room, she saw the full panel seated already, along with 2 attorneys she had never met and did not need to be introduced to understand. The director spoke in practiced tones about reputational risk and fiduciary responsibility and legal exposure, and Hannah listened as if a stranger were being described in careful detail, while her own name floated somewhere above her like a bistan verdict not yet spoken aloud. They told her that the clinic depended on public trust, and that recent events had compromised that trust, through no intentional fault of her own, but with consequences they could no longer ignore. The language wrapped her dismissal in courtesy, yet the meaning landed without cushion. She was being terminated effective immediately, in order to preserve the stability of the institution and to protect the vulnerable population they served. One of the attorneys slid a folder across the table without meeting her eyes. Inside were papers that listed severance and non-disclosure obligations and a mutual agreement not to pursue further action if she complied. Hannah did not touch the folder. She asked only whether any of her patients had asked for her removal. The director said no, yet his voice faltered just enough for her to understand. The decision had not come from the people who knew her work. It had come from rooms like this one where survival was measured in optics rather than in human continuity. When Hannah walked back onto the therapy floor to gather her things, a hush spread that felt heavier than any shout. Her nurse supervisor followed her into the supply room where she kept her notebooks and asked in a whispered voice whether this was true. Hannah nodded and felt the weight of the confirmation settle into the space between them. A veteran in a wheelchair reached for her hand when she passed and asked whether she would be back tomorrow. She knelt in front of him and said that she would not, and that she was sorry. The word sorry felt useless against the trust she was leaving behind. By the time she exited through the side door with a single box of personal items, the cameras had returned as if they had been waiting for the scent of blood. Someone shouted her name with the false familiarity of public ownership and asked whether she blamed the billionaire for her downfall. Hannah did not answer. She kept walking, with her head lifted in a gesture she had learned from patients who stood for the first time after months of failure. Each step felt like defiance carried on shaking legs. Lucas was waiting across the street when she reached the curb, and the look on his face told her he already knew. She did not speak until they were inside the car with the doors closed and the world muted again. She told him that she had been fired, and he struck the steering wheel once in a gesture of restrained violence that startled her more than any scream would have. He said that he would buy the clinic, if that was what it took to undo what they had done, and the reflex in his voice both moved and frightened her. Hannah asked him to stop. She told him that if he tried to solve this with ownership, the story would calcify exactly the way her enemies wanted it to. She would never again be seen as a woman who had lost her job to injustice. She would only be seen as a woman who had been rescued by money. The distinction mattered more to her than the relief he was offering. Lucas fell silent, and the car filled with the sound of the road. He drove her home without argument, but the tension between them tightened into something sharp and unstable. By afternoon, the headlines had turned her termination into confirmation. Commentators who had questioned her motives now presented the firing as evidence that the clinic had finally recognized the truth of her character. Phrases like moral risk and ethical contamination appeared in print beside her photograph, as if they were medical diagnoses rather than editorial constructions. A veteran advocacy group posted a statement distancing itself from her, and Hannah read it while sitting on the floor of her apartment with the box of her life at her feet, and felt a hollow open inside her that even rage could not fill. Lucas called every hour with updates. She did not ask for about the calls he was making, and the threats of action he was issuing, and the damage he was containing. Each update made the walls of her small living room feel closer. By evening, a new development arrived without warning. A uniformed process server knocked on her door just after dark and asked her by name to acknowledge receipt of legal documents. The man was polite and efficient, and gone within a minute, yet the envelope he left behind burned with a weight that did not belong to paper. Inside was a formal notice of civil action, filed by an organization that described itself as a protector of community morality. The suit accused her of exploiting her professional position to gain access to donor networks under false pretenses, and alleged that her relationship with Lucas constituted fraudulent inducement for potential financial gain. The language was precise and merciless, and it constructed a story so complete that there was no room left for her to breathe inside it. Hannah called Lucas for the first time that day and told him what had arrived. He was at her door less than 15 minutes later with his legal partner at his side, and the two of them filled her small living space with the gravity of imminent war. The lawyer spoke carefully about injunctions and strategic response, and the deep improbability that the suit would survive early motions, yet he also acknowledged the time and spectacle it could still consume before that failure became visible. Hannah listened with a focus she did not feel, and asked only one question. She asked who was funding the action. The lawyer met Lucas' eyes before answering and said that the money trail suggested shell organizations tied to a group of investors who had recently lost against Lucas in a hostile acquisition attempt. The suit was not about morality at all. It was about leverage. Hannah felt a bitter clarity settle into place. Her name was now a weapon being used by men who did not care whether it survived the conflict they had pulled it into. That night, the man who had waited behind the clinic began to follow her openly. Hannah first saw him across the street as she stepped out to buy groceries, because she had realized she had not eaten since morning. He did not hide when their eyes met. He simply stood with his phone at his ear and watched her as if noting a schedule. When she returned home, he was gone, but the feeling remained. Later, 2 missed calls appeared on her phone from numbers she did not recognize, and the voicemail contained only silence before disconnecting. Lucas wanted to move her immediately to a location with security and privacy, and Hannah refused again. She told him that running now would harden the narrative they were already trying to impose on her, and that she would not vanish like a fugitive in her own life. He argued that visibility without protection would make her a moving target, and the tension between them escalated into voices they had not yet raised with each other. The argument ended not with victory but with exhaustion. They both understood that whatever choice she made now would cost her something she could not replace. The next morning, Hannah left her apartment early and took the bus to the coastline where she used to walk with patients who were relearning balance. She needed to feel the rhythm of something that did not respond to headlines or filings. The man from the night before appeared again at the far end of the path and walked parallel to her without approaching. She stopped once, and he stopped too at exactly the same distance. The choreography confirmed what she had already known. She was being watched, not by curiosity now but by intent. When she turned back toward the street he followed, and she felt the first true flicker of fear rise, unfiltered by pride or principle. She did not want to test how far the watchers would go for the sake of leverage. She called Lucas and told him where she was, and he arrived with security in minutes, and the man melted into the city as if he had never been real. By afternoon another protest gathered outside her building, and this one did not pretend to be peaceful. Signs accused her of corruption and lies and betrayal, and the slogans took on a possessive tone as if her existence now belonged to the outrage she had generated. Police dispersed the crowd before nightfall, but the message had been delivered. She was no longer only judged. She was being hunted by story and by shadow. That evening, Lucas told her that he could no longer allow the danger to remain abstract, and that measures would be taken whether she approved or not. Hannah looked at the man she cared for, whose power now drew both protection and peril into her living room, and felt the fracture inside her widen. She had lost her job, her name, her ordinary life, and now even the illusion of anonymity that had once been her safest refuge. As darkness filled the windows, she understood that the attack had entered a new phase, and that whatever remained of her old world was already out of reach. The lawsuit broke across the internet at dawn with the authority of something that looked official enough to be believed and vague enough to be feared. Headlines announced that Hannah Miller was being sued for civil fraud by a moral advocacy organization, claiming she had exploited donor networks through deception and intimacy. The phrasing suggested investigation rather than invention, and within hours the story had hardened into assumed fact. Hannah learned about it not from the documents already in her apartment, but from a message on her phone from a former coworker asking in shaking words if the accusations were true. The question hurt more than the filing because it meant doubt had already taken root in a place where trust once lived. By mid-morning, the complaint had been shared on every major gossip platform and extracted into summarized accusations that stripped away the legal cautions and left only the ugliest interpretation behind. They said she had manufactured innocence as currency. They said she had targeted Lucas for access, not affection. They said she had compromised a clinic built for service for her own ambition. No article mentioned that the suit had yet to be proven or that the filing organization had no established history outside sudden outrage campaigns. The speed of the narrative did not require evidence because it moved on appetite alone. Hannah did not go outside that day. The sidewalk had become a corridor of lenses and phones by late morning, and by afternoon the chanting returned with new slogans written in the language of accusation rather than question. Lucas stayed with her despite her protests that he was making the target larger by remaining visible. He told her that absence would be interpreted as guilt anyway, and that he would not allow her to be defined alone in a room without witnesses. His legal team arrived shortly after noon and spread the complaint across her kitchen table, as if mapping a battlefield where the terrain itself lied. They explained that the suit had been filed in a jurisdiction that favored rapid injunction requests and maximum public visibility. They explained that the plaintiffs were seeking symbolic damages with the intention of generating discovery demands that could be leaked for narrative advantage regardless of outcome. Hannah listened with the steady focus she usually reserved for patients in crisis and understood enough to feel the shape of the trap. The suit was not designed to win. It was designed to wound repeatedly in public. Lucas' lawyers moved quickly. By late afternoon they had traced a chain of financial transfers that led not to any moral organization, but to a network of shell foundations tied to the same investment group that had attempted to force a merger with Ward Neurolabs months earlier and failed. The lawsuit was leverage born not of outrage but of revenge. Hannah felt a brief surge of vindication at the discovery, and then, the cold understanding that truth alone did not disarm a weapon built for spectacle. The team prepared a motion to dismiss supported by evidence that demonstrated the suit lacked standing and material basis. They warned her that while the court might move swiftly, the public might not. Hannah asked how long the lie could live even after being disproved. One of the attorneys answered with gentle honesty that some lies never died because they were more useful than correction. That evening, Lucas recorded a statement from his office and released it to every major outlet at once. He named the funding behind the suit and presented documents showing coordinated efforts to use Hannah as a pressure point against his company. He declined to defend her character as something separate from his position. He defended her as a fact. The distinction mattered to him, even if the audience preferred confession to proof. The response was immediate and divided. Some outlets reframed the story as corporate warfare with a damaged woman in the middle. Others accused Lucas of manipulating the courts to protect a personal interest. The organization that had filed the suit issued a counterstatement denying any financial ties to the investors named and praised Hannah's bravery in facing scrutiny with a tone that tried to disguise retreat as virtue. The contradiction landed without resolution and the noise swallowed it whole. The following morning, Hannah was summoned to the courthouse for an emergency hearing on an injunction request filed by the plaintiffs, seeking to freeze her assets and restrict her from accessing donor-affiliated networks during the investigation. The suit had already escaped the bounds of plausibility and entered performance. Lucas wanted to keep her from appearing in person and offered to handle the matter through counsel. Hannah refused. She said that every time her body was removed from the scene, her story was replaced with an idea she could not control. She would walk into the courtroom and be seen as a human being even if the room did not care. Lucas did not argue. He only asked if she wanted him beside her. She said yes. The courthouse steps were crowded with cameras and hired signs, and the familiar man who had followed her before stood across the street with his phone lifted, as if documenting proof of attendance rather than history in the making. Inside, the hearing moved with mechanical precision. The judge listened to the plaintiff's attorney describe Hannah as a calculated actor who used seduction as an accelerant for social mobility. The language was dramatic in ways briefs rarely were, and it revealed more about the intention of the case than any fact could. Hannah watched from her seat as if listening to a foreign language spoken in the cadence of her own life. When her attorney rose in response, he presented the financial trail with quiet clarity and asked the plaintiffs to identify one verified donation that Hannah had ever facilitated for personal gain. The opposing counsel evaded and returned to suggestion. The judge did not allow the evasion to stand. She denied the injunction on the spot and admonished the plaintiffs for the misuse of emergency procedure. The gavel strike that followed cut through more than the motion. It cut through the first public iteration of the lie. Reporters flooded the hallway as Hannah exited, and she answered only one question before her attorney intervened. When asked whether she felt vindicated, she said that she felt tired, and that fatigue was not the same as guilt. The sentence traveled far and fast, and carried more impact than any denial might have. By nightfall, several outlets issued retractions of their earlier framing and appended updates that named the investor network behind the suit. The moral organization website went dark without explanation, and its social media accounts ceased all activity. The lawsuit that had arrived with such authority dissolved as quickly as it had materialized. 3 days later, the court formally dismissed the case in full. Yet, the relief did not arrive the way Hannah expected it to. The headlines changed, but the impressions they had left behind remained like ash that did not vanish when the fire was extinguished. Some people accepted the correction. Others insisted that legal dismissal did not equal moral innocence. The damage did not reverse itself with symmetry. Lucas was furious in a way she had never seen, and told her that those who had orchestrated the attack would face consequences equal to the harm they had tried to impose. Hannah listened and felt the distance between justice and repair widen inside her. She had not wanted revenge. She had wanted her life to return. That option no longer existed. Late that night, Hannah stood alone on her balcony watching the last camera crew retreat from the street below. The man who had followed her was gone too, and she realized with a quiet clarity that he had never been hired to protect her, or even to threaten her directly. He had been hired to remind her that she could be reached. The reminder had been delivered. Lucas joined her with 2 cups of tea he had learned she drank when sleep refused to come, and for a moment they stood without speaking. She told him that the suit had failed, but that something else had succeeded. It had taught the world that she could be used as terrain. Lucas answered that he would never allow that terrain to be unguarded again. Hannah said that guards built walls and she had already lost too much sky. The next morning, a new message waited on her phone from an unknown number that did not bother to hide its threat. It said only that the suit had been a warning, and that the real consequences would begin when she felt most alone. Hannah did not show Lucas the message at first. She understood without asking that the lawsuit had never been real in the way justice was real. It had been a dress rehearsal for something far more dangerous, because it had proven that the story could be bent and the crowd could be aimed. The legal battle had been won in days. The war for her life had only just begun. Hannah thought she understood what it meant to walk away, until she discovered how different it felt to choose it, while someone powerful pleaded for her to stay. The message with the hidden threat still sat unread in her phone, like a splinter she refused to pull, while Lucas moved around her world trying to build walls where she felt only doors should exist. Security vehicles appeared at the corner without announcement. A private driver waited outside her building each morning without asking where she wished to go. Lawyers spoke about protective orders and temporary relocation as if these were weather patterns she could simply adapt to. Lucas offered solutions in the only language his world had ever taught him, and each solution carried a price she did not want to pay, even when she did not know what the alternative would cost. When he asked her to move into one of his properties until the pressure eased, she looked at him with a sadness that surprised them both. She told him that comfort purchased by retreat would feel like surrender dressed as safety. Lucas argued that the danger was not symbolic anymore, and that people had already proven they were willing to follow her and frighten her for the sake of leverage. Hannah answered that fear did not grant anyone ownership of her choices, and that she would not be managed like a crisis by the man she loved no matter how much she needed him. The word loved slipped between them without ceremony, and they both felt it land with weight. That afternoon, Lucas tried a different argument that cut deeper because it reached for reason rather than power. He told her that the Watchers were not just investors anymore, and that the people funding the shell groups had ties to private intelligence contractors who thrived on intimidation. He told her that what began as spectacle could escalate into something with permanent consequences. Hannah listened and did not doubt him. She had already felt the presence of that escalation in the shape of shadows that moved when she moved. Still, she shook her head. She told him that she had already lost her job, her reputation, and her ordinary future, and that if she also lost the right to decide where her own body stood, she would become exactly the kind of symbol her attackers wanted her to be. Lucas asked her what she planned to do instead. Hannah told him she would leave San Diego on her own terms, before she would disappear into a protected life designed by someone else. The statement stunned him, and for the first time she saw something like fear cross his face, not for her safety but for the distance she was creating. She left that night with a single suitcase and no destination she was ready to share. Lucas wanted to drive her himself, and she refused. She told him that if she allowed his protection to escort her departure, the story would follow her wearing his shadow. She needed to step into the open without his armor or not at all. At the bus station, a camera flashed once, and Hannah realized that even now, she could not be certain whether she was being seen by journalists or by men hired to watch until someone else decided she had been frightened enough. When the bus doors closed, she felt the strange, hollow relief of motion that asked nothing of her but to endure the passing of miles. She did not send Lucas a message before leaving. She left behind only a note on the kitchen counter written in steady script that said she needed to remember who she was before the world decided who she should be. The town she chose was small and forgettable by design, a place of faded storefronts and long stretches of road where no one expected to meet a billionaire or the woman who had been accused of chasing one. Hannah took a room above a hardware store with thin walls and a single window that looked out over the street. She paid a month in advance in cash, and the landlord did not ask questions. The morning after her arrival, she walked the town twice without seeing her name on a screen or hearing it on another person's mouth, and felt a cautious version of peace begin to form. She found temporary work at a community center, helping elderly residents with mobility exercises, and felt the familiar satisfaction of usefulness without headlines attached to it. But the quiet did not last as long as she pretended it might. On the fourth day, a car she did not recognize idled across the street from the center for nearly an hour before driving away without purpose. That evening, she found a small envelope slipped under her door with no return address, and nothing inside it but a single photo of Lucas standing outside her old building taken from across the street. The message it carried needed no words. Hannah did not call Lucas after that. She told herself that involving him again would only sharpen the leverage her enemies already believed they possessed through her. Instead, she changed her routine and took different routes and kept her phone dark for hours at a time. The effort felt both ridiculous and necessary. She began to sleep in short intervals and wake to the sound of her own breath moving too fast in the dark. The community center director asked once whether something was wrong, because Hannah flinched at every unexpected noise, and she answered that she was adjusting. The truth was that she was being taught how far fear could travel even without footsteps. Lucas sent messages that she did not answer at first, then began to read without replying. In them, he told her that his legal assault on the investors had begun in full, and that federal agencies were now examining the shell organizations tied to the lawsuit. He told her that the men funding the intimidation were losing ground, but that desperation often replaced strategy when power was threatened. Hannah read the words and felt the distance between their worlds stretch like something elastic and dangerous. One evening, as she left the center, a man stepped out from between two parked cars and asked her by name whether she missed the ocean yet. His tone was casual, his eyes were not. Hannah did not answer. She changed direction and felt his footsteps follow at a deliberate pace that did not rush because it did not need to. A truck honked at the corner, and the sound broke the moment long enough for her to cross the street and disappear into the open doorway of the grocery store. She stayed there until the manager asked if she needed help, and when she looked back through the glass, the man was gone. The message was complete. She could be reached anywhere she chose to run. That night, Hannah finally called Lucas. She told him what had happened in careful sentences that refused panic. Lucas did not hide his fury this time. He told her that the intimidation had crossed a line from narrative to threat, and that he would no longer ask for her permission to neutralize it. Hannah answered that she was no longer certain that his kind of neutralization would end with her still owning herself. The argument moved in circles. Neither of them had the strength to break. Lucas promised her that he would dismantle the network behind the harassment completely. Hannah told him that she did not doubt his ability, and that her fear lay in the collateral that always followed power battles. When the call ended, she felt the fragile bridge between them strain under the weight of their different languages for safety. 2 days later, federal agents arrested the owner of one of the Shell foundations on charges related to financial fraud and coercion. The news arrived with the dry specificity of public record and the private intensity of relief that did not feel earned. Lucas texted her a single word: done, and she read it with the understanding that nothing that preceded it had truly been done at all. That night, another envelope appeared under her door, and she opened it to find nothing but shredded paper. The threat no longer needed form. It lived in repetition. Hannah sat on her bed and felt the realization deepen that money could disrupt a system, but it could not undo the fear that system had already planted in her. Lucas could collapse networks and freeze assets and call down investigations. He could not make the night quiet again for her. He could not restore the moment when she still believed that walking away meant escape rather than exposure. The next morning she packed her suitcase again. This time she did not leave town. She left the room. She moved to a cheap motel on the outskirts where anonymity was enforced by neglect rather than security, and where no one cared enough to follow patterns. She did not tell Lucas where she was going. She did not tell anyone. The silence felt like the only protection she had not yet tried. As she lay on the motel bed staring at the cracks in the ceiling, she understood with painful clarity that the tragedy was not that his money could not save her. The tragedy was that it had taught too many people that saving her was something they were entitled to attempt whether she asked for it or not. Hannah left before sunrise with the kind of quiet that only belongs to people who no longer expect to be missed. The motel clerk did not look up when she slid the key across the counter, and the small mercy of anonymity felt heavier than any goodbye. She walked 2 blocks to the highway shoulder, where trucks cut through the dark with indifferent speed, and waited for the bus that would take her farther inland than she had ever planned to go. She carried one bag that held only the things she could not bear to lose, and nothing that reminded her of who she had been before the world decided to burn her name into a spectacle. When the bus arrived, she took the first seat near the back and watched the town dissolve in the glass without feeling regret. She felt only distance begin to work like a slow medicine in her chest. Lucas woke to the absence before he knew its shape. Her messages had already fallen quiet, but the silence that morning carried a different temperature. He drove first to her apartment where the door sat unopened, and then to the hardware store room where she had stayed, and finally to the community center, where a volunteer told him she had not come in that day. By noon he knew she had moved beyond the range of his maps without leaving a trail he was allowed to follow. He wanted to send his team everywhere at once, and instead he forced himself to stand still and honor the boundary she had drawn with her disappearance. Hannah rode through 2 state lines by nightfall and disembarked in a city built on intersections rather than landmarks. The station hummed with ordinary endings and beginnings that did not care about her past, and she let herself blur into the movement with relief that nearly broke her open. She rented a room by the week in a building that smelled of soap and hot asphalt, and slept on a mattress that sank in the middle like a warning. In the morning she walked until her feet learned the shape of the streets, and took the first job that did not ask questions beyond whether she could show up on time. News traveled to her slowly and sideways like smoke from a fire she had already outrun. At the diner, a customer mentioned the Billionaire scandal, as if it were a plotline that had already resolved into a footnote. At the laundromat, a woman on her phone read aloud a headline about investor indictments with vague interest. Hannah kept her eyes on the floor and learned how to live below the threshold of recognition. The relief of obscurity brought its own ache. She missed the veterans who knew her voice before they trusted her face. She missed the ocean even when she pretended not to. The first envelope arrived at the diner one afternoon, addressed only to the name she used now. Inside was a single sentence printed without signature: "You cannot disappear from a story that was written to follow you." Hannah crumpled the paper and threw it into the trash with a hand that did not tremble. She did not tell the manager. She did not leave. If fear followed her, she would not grant it power by naming it. 2 days later, a car idled at the corner across from her building long enough for memory to recognize the shape of patience in its stance. It drove away when a delivery truck pulled in front of it, and Hannah understood that the window of peace she had imagined was narrower than she had hoped. Lucas learned through channels he pretended not to use. A message from an old contact in federal finance told him that surveillance tails previously attached to Shell assets had gone dark. A second message from a private sector analyst suggested that whoever had funded the original pressure campaign had stepped back without relinquishing interest. He realized with a cold understanding that the real purpose of the intimidation had never been to force Hannah to capitulate. It had been to test how far she could be driven before she broke. Weeks passed into a new rhythm Hannah did not trust but learned to inhabit. She woke before dawn and worked until the afternoon and returned to a room that belonged to no one else. She saved what little she could and mailed anonymous donations to a veterans fund she followed online without attaching her name. In the diner kitchen, she learned the comfort of repetition and the quiet dignity of competence that did not require witnesses. Some nights she dreamed of water and woke with the taste of salt in her mouth. She did not reach for the phone she kept in the drawer like a promise she was not ready to open. The second envelope arrived 3 weeks after the first. This time it contained a photograph of Lucas at courthouse steps surrounded by cameras, and the suggestion underneath that he had traded one battle for another. The implication was not that he was under threat but that he was being kept busy. Hannah understood the message for what it was. The pressure could be dialed up or down at will because it was no longer about leverage. It was about reminding her that distance had not placed her outside the reach of the people who wanted to move her life like a piece on their board. Lucas sent one message that she read and did not answer. It was simple and without strategy. I am not trying to reach you through the world anymore. I am here if you ever choose to reach back. She closed the phone and sat on the edge of her bed until the room returned to focus. The words did not trap her, but they did not free her either. They settled somewhere between, like a bridge that did not yet know which shore it served. By the end of the month, Hannah understood the full meaning of walking away with nothing. It was not only the loss of work and reputation and city and lover, it was the loss of the version of herself who believed those things were fixed coordinates rather than conditions that could be stripped without appeal. She learned to eat once a day without hunger, and to smile without invitation, and to trust without assuming permanence. The world had taken from her the right to be believed on sight. In the absence of that certainty, she built a quieter kind of integrity that did not ask to be recognized in order to exist. One evening, as she left the diner under a sky that held no ocean in its breath, a man brushed past her shoulder and murmured her real name without slowing his steps. The sound stopped her cold in the middle of the sidewalk while everything else continued. By the time she turned, he was already swallowed by a crowd that did not know what it had just carried away. Hannah stood very still and felt the last illusion fall into place. She had not walked away from the story after all. She had merely stepped into the part where she was alone inside it. Lucas did not move money first, and that fact alone shocked the people who believed they understood him. He moved names instead. He pulled quiet strings of relationships that did not show on balance sheets, and called in favors that could not be repaid with checks. He spoke to regulators who had once believed in his early work, and to reporters who still trusted the evidence more than spectacle. He asked questions that forced others to answer in rooms without cameras. The strategy was slower than buying outcomes and far more dangerous to those who had built their power on shadows. The investor network that had tested Hannah through fear did not notice the shift until doors began to close in their faces at the same time across different cities. Meetings were postponed without explanation. Access vanished without appeal. Their ability to threaten relied on the illusion that they were unseen. Lucas began to make them visible without announcing that he had done so. He worked from borrowed space without company insignia, and traveled without security, in order to hear what people said when they believed they were safe. For the first time in his career, he learned what it meant to move through a world that did not bend for him. He listened more than he spoke and recorded everything. Hannah felt the change without seeing its source. The car that had idled at her corner did not return. The envelope stopped arriving. The name whispered into the night did not repeat. The absence felt artificial at first, like a held breath that would eventually be released. Weeks passed and the threat did not reappear. The quiet grew unfamiliar. She waited for the strike that usually followed the lull, and when it did not, she began to understand that something beyond her knowledge had shifted. She did not assume safety. She learned instead how to occupy uncertainty without surrendering to it. Lucas built his case without the theater his enemies expected. He uncovered that the organization used to file the suit had been incorporated and dissolved within days under different names to simulate grassroots legitimacy. He tied the shell foundations to a private intelligence firm that specialized in pressure campaigns designed to destabilize targets emotionally rather than financially. He traced payments that traveled through 3 countries before returning to the same set of hands that had attempted to control his company through proxy shareholders. Each discovery formed a link in a chain that could not be dismissed as coincidence. When his lawyers suggested monetizing the information to accelerate official response, he refused and said that truth delivered for sale often forgot the people it was meant to protect. The war became public only when several arrests occurred within the same 48-hour window across different states. Charges ranged from financial fraud to illegal surveillance to coercion. The names that surfaced did not include the men at the highest tier, but they shattered enough of the infrastructure to expose the shape of the machine. News outlets framed the story as a corporate takedown, and speculated about whether Lucas had finally turned the full weight of his empire against its enemies. They were wrong. The damage had been inflicted without his money. It had been delivered through exposure alone. His fortune had given him reach before. Now reach gave him restraint. Hannah learned pieces of the story through public channels and fragments, passed along by co-workers who did not know they were speaking to the woman at the center of the storm they described. She did not connect the dots immediately, because she had trained herself not to search for patterns that could reopen old fear. The day she did understand came when she overheard the diner owner say that the firm rumored to specialize in intimidation had lost its operating license abruptly due to federal inquiry. The statement slid into her life like a quiet current, and she felt something steady beneath it. She went home and opened the drawer and took out her phone and read the message from Lucas again. "I am here if you ever choose to reach back." For the first time she believed that he had meant the words without reserve. Lucas waited without pressing. He told himself that timing belonged to her now, and not to the momentum of crisis that had defined their last days together. He continued the work because it had become necessary not only for her safety, but for the lives that would have been broken in similar ways if the network had survived intact. He sat in small offices with people who had once been approached with threats, disguised as offers, and asked them what had kept them silent. Many said that they had believed they were alone. The phrase repeated until it no longer sounded accidental. Lucas realized that the most efficient weapon his enemies used was isolation. Hannah had been made to feel alone, so that she would fracture herself without external force. He returned to the coastal city weeks later not as a retreat but as a test. He walked streets that still carried the echo of cameras, and felt nothing move in his wake. He passed the buildings where Hannah had once lived and worked, and allowed himself to stand without anger in the spaces where he had once tried to protect by force. The city had already replaced their names with newer spectacles. The world had moved on. The truth never moved as quickly as myth. Lucas accepted that and waited. Hannah stepped back into contact on a gray afternoon when she closed the diner early due to rain. She sent one message with no preface: "Are you still there?" The response arrived without delay and without explanation. "Always." They began with small sentences that did not reopen wounds all at once. He told her that the intimidation network was being dismantled. She told him that the city she lived in now had no ocean, and that sometimes that hurt more than the fear ever had. He told her he had learned how to ride public buses without being recognized. She made a joke about how long that might last. They let laughter build a bridge where arguments once stood. When she finally agreed to meet him, she chose a neutral place between their worlds, a park that rested beside a river and had no reason to be remembered by history. He arrived alone. She watched him from a distance as if testing whether he still carried authority in the cut of his movement. She found that he moved differently now, without command in his posture. When he saw her, he did not step forward at once. He waited until she closed half the space herself. They spoke without touching for a while, and let the air prove that distance did not have to be dangerous anymore. Hannah asked him whether the war was over. Lucas said that wars rarely ended in ways that felt final, but that this one had lost its machinery. He told her that the men who could have reached her anywhere no longer possessed that reach. He told her that there would always be people who tried to turn fear into profit, and that he did not believe pretending otherwise was protective. Hannah said that she did not need certainty anymore. She needed only the chance to choose without coercion. Lucas said that the world had already taken enough from her, and that he would no longer stand between her and any choice she made, even if that choice did not include him. They walked along the river until dusk settled, and lights began to gather without ceremony. Hannah felt the old pull rise, and did not resist it. She told him that she had walked away with nothing because she could not be saved in pieces. She had needed to lose everything to learn what could not be taken. Lucas listened and understood that the sentence was not indictment, but map. He told her that he had gone to war without his billions, because money had failed her once, and he would never again ask it to carry her name as shield or weapon. In that admission, something between them realigned. They did not promise what came next. They acknowledged only that the space ahead was no longer dictated by those who had tried to own the story. For the first time since the lie that had begun it all, they stood somewhere unscripted. Hannah returned to the coast without announcement, and without fear announcing her first. The ocean greeted her with the same patient breath it always had, as if nothing between its tides had ever learned her name. She walked the familiar streets as a person, rather than a headline, and waited for recognition that did not come. The city had moved on the way cities always did, replacing yesterday with today, and never apologizing for the exchange. She stepped back into the clinic where she had once been dismissed without a single mention of the scandal, and found her place again, not as a symbol, but as a pair of steady hands and a listening presence. Lucas did not accompany her return. She had not asked him to, and he had not insisted. The space between them had become something they honored rather than feared. He sent one message that morning and wished her steadiness rather than success. Hannah felt the grace of that choice as keenly as if he had stood at her side. The work began quietly. Patience came without knowing the story they had once consumed, and Hannah learned how to listen again without the echo of judgment pressing against the back of every word. Outside the clinic, her name slowly shifted its meaning. A journalist published an investigative piece that traced the intimidation network from its inception to its dismantling, and positioned Hannah not as a scandal but as a case study in how easily lives could be bent when power decided to test its reach. The article ran without photographs, and refused the spectacle that had once defined her. It did not correct every lie, but it cut a through line of clarity across the narrative chaos, and enough people followed it to change the shape of what her name evoked. Lucas remained at a careful distance as his own world recalibrated after the fall of the network that had tested them both. The indictments expanded upward as those who had believed themselves untouchable discovered the limits of anonymity in a season suddenly uninterested in shielding their kind. Investigations spread beyond the initial firms and into the regulatory agencies that had once allowed quiet exceptions to flourish. Lucas testified without protection and without his usual armor of neutrality. He did not use Hannah as shield or rallying cry. He made it clear that her life had not been collateral damage in a business war, but the human cost of systems that treated people as movable boundaries. Months passed, and Hannah's life settled into a pattern that resembled the one she had lost without trying to replace it. She kept her apartment small and her routines ordinary, and said no to most invitations that promised visibility as virtue. One evening, after a long session with a patient who had learned to speak again after years of holding breath, she walked to the beach and sat until dusk thinned into a private kind of blue. Lucas joined her without noise and sat at a distance that allowed room for choice rather than expectation. They spoke easily and without urgency, and when he reached for her hand she did not pull away or lean in too quickly. The tide answered with its patient rhythm, and neither of them tried to hurry it. They built their relationship again without rescue as currency, and without crisis as glue. Dates were coffee and long walks and shared silences that did not demand proof. Lucas did not offer to solve her finances, and Hannah did not pretend that independence meant isolation anymore. They learned each other in the absence of spectacle and discovered how little of intimacy required defense when no one was watching. The proposal came without kneeling and without a ring dramatic enough to attract a lens. Lucas asked simply whether she would continue choosing him now that choosing him no longer defied anyone. Hannah said yes because the word felt like a direction rather than a declaration. They did not announce the engagement to the world, and the world discovered it anyway, in the casual way worlds do when headlines no longer hunger for a name. The wedding took place 6 months later in a small courtyard behind the clinic where Hannah now worked full-time. Patients attended alongside friends who had stood quiet when noise would have benefited them most. Lucas' brother sat in the back and did not speak until asked, and when asked spoke only of accountability, learned at a late hour. There were no cameras and no speeches larger than the moment would bear. After the ceremony, they stayed by the ocean alone until evening leaned toward night, and the city drew close enough to hum again. Hannah told Lucas that her name felt strange on her tongue, sometimes as if it still carried someone else's echo in it. Lucas told her that names learned their meaning from how they were spoken, and that he intended to spend his life speaking hers without spectacle. Hannah laughed because the sentence was almost too like the man she had first met, and almost entirely unlike the man who had once tried to save her with money. In the months that followed, the Veterans Fund expanded into a formal foundation with public oversight and private restraint. Hannah served on its board without salary and without title, and found a satisfaction in influence that did not demand ownership. The clinic thrived and became a model for integrated trauma care that was studied rather than sensationalized. Lucas redirected sizable resources into regulatory compliance rather than expansion, and surprised analysts who had expected quieter retaliation. One evening, as she walked home from the clinic, a woman approached and asked whether she was the therapist who had once been called a liar on the internet. Hannah said yes without bracing herself. The woman nodded and said that she had believed the lie once, and that she was sorry. Hannah said thank you without needing to understand the apology beyond its offering. The woman walked away lighter than she had arrived, and Hannah felt the exchange settle into her as a quiet form of restoration that did not announce itself. Hannah's name returned to her not in headlines or corrections, but in small acts repeated until they no longer felt borrowed. It returned in the way Patience trusted her without question, and in the way her husband waited without pressure, and in the way she slept through the night without listening for footsteps. The lie that had begun it all did not vanish from history and did not need to. It lost the authority to define what followed it. In the end, Hannah did not reclaim her name by defeating her enemies or proving her worth to the world. She reclaimed it by living inside it again without apology. If this story moved you even a little, do not let that feeling pass quietly, because stories only truly live when they are shared and remembered. Hannah and Lucas' journey was built from fear, courage, mistakes, and the stubborn choice to keep walking when the world tried to decide who she was for her. If you have ever been misunderstood, judged too quickly, or labeled by a single moment you did not choose, then this story was written for you. Right now, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today, and what part of Hannah's story touched you the most? Was it the lie that started everything the moment she lost everything, or the quiet way she took her name back? Leave a comment and tell us your city and your thought, because every single voice here matters. If you believe love should be built on respect instead of rescue, then tap the like button so more people who need this story can find it. If you believe a woman does not have to be saved to be worthy, then share this with someone who needs that reminder tonight. And if you want more stories that cut deep into the heart and still leave room for hope, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. New stories are coming, and they will challenge you, heal you, and remind you that even after the worst storms, people can still choose light. Before you go, I want to ask you one simple question that says a lot about who you are. If you were in Hannah's place, would you have walked away with nothing like she did, or would you have stayed and fought beside Lucas from the beginning? Type walk away or stay and fight in the comments, and let us see just how different our hearts really are. Your answers might surprise you, and they might inspire someone else who is deciding their own next step right now. Thank you for listening until the very end, because that tells me you are the kind of person who does not give up on a story halfway through. And just like Hannah, you deserve a future that is not defined by your worst moment, but shaped by your bravest choice. Stay with us, because the next story will explore another impossible love, another hidden truth, and another heart that people tried to break but could not. This channel is built for those who believe that pain can become purpose, and that ordinary people can still change extraordinary lives. Your presence here already proves that you are part of that belief. So once more, like, share, subscribe, and speak up below, because your comment might be the one someone else reads when they feel alone tonight. We read every message, and your voice shapes what comes next. Join us now, and let your story connect with ours. It starts here,